toy.
William Wagener here. Society for Criminology is having a meeting in downtown San Francisco with speakers on every facet of crime, its prevention, and statistical analysis of crime at the Marriott Hotel.
The schedule, Travis will be presenting. Thank you very much again for coming. I'll turn it over to Travis.
I'd like to add, I was working on this, as many of us kind of do, at the last minute this morning, and it just appears that I forgot to put my name on it. So as Zach said, I'm Travis, and this is my paper as part of my dissertation work. I want to start off with a little story that kind of feeds into my general question on how I arrived at this research. 2 years ago, I had the occasion to attend a research institute here in California, sponsored by a couple UC universities. And part of that research institute's process was to bring young PhD students together with prominent established scholars, important people in the field for one-on-one mentoring. So at one point in time, I got to sit down with a giant person in the field and talk about my research, as many of us other attendees did. And I just kind of threw this question out to him, because a lot of the research that I read about mass incarceration really, assumes the frame of urban. So I asked him, this is my general question. How do law and order politics of mass incarceration, mass imprisonment manifest in context outside the city? And he looked at me, and the first thing he said, well, you're going to have to get to know meth then. And I thought that was very interesting because, I mentioned crime, I mentioned rural, and obviously, you put together the equation equals meth. And then the next thing he said, he was kind of a more pointed question. He looked at me and he said, Travis, do you like the Midwest? And I said, yeah, I grew up in the Midwest, been there my entire life. He's like, that's good, because no one outside the Midwest is going to care about rural crime. And I thought, well, that was interesting, but a very pointed comment, and it reflects kind of the balance of the literature to date about what I'm going to talk about. Issues of rural crime and morality are often kind of underplayed or ignored. So let's talk about methamphetamine, as this prominent scholar urged me to do. What I want to focus on today more are the cultural aspects and kind of the political rhetoric around methamphetamine and how that relates to issues of criminalization, crime, marginality, policing, these sorts of things in rural areas. So beginning in 1989, even though many people framed methamphetamine as the next big thing, to quote Brian King with the Sentencing Project, methamphetamine has been around for quite some time, and it began to peak into public consciousness in the late 80s. In a prominent New York Times article titled, "Fear Grows Over the Effects of New Smokable Drugs." So they frame it as a new drug even in 1989, and this is a trope that continues to be reproduced over time, as you'll see. One of the quotes in here, "Smokable methamphetamine will be the drug plague of the 1990s." And this is directly from the spokesperson for the drug czar at the time, William Bennett. So very strong claims even in 1989. Fast forward to 1999, Oklahoma Governor Frank Keating said in a public hearing that methamphetamine is a white trash drug, largely consumed by the lower socioeconomic element of white people. And I think we need to shame it. Just like crack cocaine was a black trash drug and is a black trash drug. So, from the very beginning, the inception of this issue of methamphetamine, starkly racialized, starkly gendered. And we can see that throughout. Moving forward to 2004, prominent Senator Chuck Schumer again makes the comparison, meth being the new crack, using the analogy of a Mack truck slamming into the social body. Could become the new crack. 2007, Newsweek dubbed meth America's most dangerous drug and does a huge expose on it. One of the most interesting lines I found in this entire piece was that it says, relatively cheap compared with other hard drugs, the highly addictive stimulant is hooking more and more people across the socioeconomic spectrum. Soccer moms in Illinois, so if we look at the politics of racialization of drugs, is anything more whiter than a soccer mom in Illinois? All right? So it's very clear how this is constructed, even though perhaps some of the data might refute some of these constructions. Okay, so I take this from Reinerman and others, but methamphetamine, the process of criminalization and the cultural content of methamphetamine follows a similar path, just as the comparisons were made with crack. Kind of the same thing we see in the rearview mirror, as Redmond said, happening with crack or happening with methamphetamine. So we're told that there's a vast number of users. It spreads like an epidemic. Our most vulnerable are our youth or women, perhaps. And you try it one time and you're hooked. That's something that repeats throughout the history of drug criminalization in the United States. Just some quick data. Methamphetamine as an issue appears and reappears. Phil Jenkins wrote an article in 1994 citing many of these same things, and he said it's going to come back again in 1994. He was quite right. So it's cyclical, as many drug panics are. It's been around for a long time. It was first synthesized in 1919. It's been here for several decades, but it becomes a new focus when it's attached to rural America, and that's going to be the focus of what I talk about here in a second. The NIDA finds that methamphetamine is actually one of the least used drugs of abuse. Less than 1% of the population use it regularly. It's used 4 times less than cocaine and much less, obviously, than marijuana. Drug use amongst the general population is relatively stable and declining amongst the youth. So again, some of the dogma about the threat is unfounded according to these data. All right, let's look at Kansas. This is really interesting. This is from the treatment episodes data set. This tracks admissions to any federally funded drug and alcohol treatment center in the United States. And you can see here are admissions for methamphetamine use in Kansas over time. You can see a marked increase. It can be quite alarming. But if you put it in context with other drugs of abuse, alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine takes on a new shape. But often when it's presented in a way that doesn't acknowledge this critical bit of information. Again, data on methamphetamine arrests are really hard to get a hold of. The only thing I could do as a proxy was state level arrest data in Kansas. So for the state, again, we can see that drug crimes compose a relatively small proportion of the total volume of arrests, and they're relatively stable over time. Again, the language of epidemic and new threat is refuted. Okay, but what I'm really interested in is the continued interest in this topic because it does focus on rural people so much, or so-called rural states. So I started to kind of investigate some of the history of the legislation that's developed in Kansas, and this was one of the first things I ran onto that I found pretty interesting. In 2005, our governor, Kathleen Sebelius, who is now the head of the Department of Health and Human Services in Obama's cabinet, came out and in her policy agenda for 2005 said, we need to worry about 3 things in Kansas in terms of safety and prosperity. And she says terrorism, natural disaster, and methamphetamine in 2005. So in a rhetorical sense, she's placing the threat of this arguably sparsely used drug on the same kind of modern level for Kansans as 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. So very powerful rhetorical statement, and policy issues follow. She says this in 2005, and this is actually another one of the only methamphetamine indicators you can get, and this is labs seized in Kansas over time. And when she says that methamphetamine is the top priority for Kansas, we're already seeing this marked drop in lab seized over time. So perhaps she missed the boat or is understating the problem. Nevertheless, newspaper coverage ensued about this particular issue. The Kansas Methamphetamine Prevention Project contracts with a news provider, and they clip every single mention of methamphetamine made in the Kansas newspaper. So these data represent mentions of methamphetamine in Kansas newspapers over time. So right around her State of the State address in 2005, you can see a large spike in the increase in discussions about methamphetamine as an issue of concern for Kansas government. Okay, so what I'm trying to get at is why this particular issue works well in rural America. Why meth? Why the racialization and connection to white folks in rural areas, even though there is some truth to production of methamphetamine being regionally concentrated, it's not as black and white. So I'm looking at theories of punitiveness, and recently Underver and Cohen reviewed and did a test of 3 families of theories that explain punitiveness. Escalating crime distrust model, kind of emblematic of John Simon's Governing Through Crime. Durkheimian moral decline model, notion of boundary maintenance, kind of traditional racial threat bodies. And what they found was the racial threat models, when estimated all together, the racial threat variables were the best predictors. Leaving me with a question, some of the communities that I do field work in, these communities are largely white, I mean into the 90th percentile white. So what if racial threat does predict punitiveness in an empirical fashion, what happens in communities where there's just white people? And I think that we have to examine that in a different way. So I started to take in kind of my theoretical thread from a lot of authors writing in the general area of ontological insecurity. It's kind of a general framework that a lot of stuff gets thrown under. But basically the idea is as social life kind of becomes eroded and deregulated